Annika McGivern,
Hello.
thank you so much for joining me on the Fitness Business Life podcast. It's been a minute.
It sure has. I'm delighted to be back.
Annika, what do my listeners need to know about Annika McGivern and her background that would frame the conversation that we're about to have?
I suppose first and foremost that I'm a sports psychologist, and what that means, I suppose, is that I have the privilege of working with a lot of very cool people, a lot of very driven people, and to help them with their goals. And specifically, I help them with the mental skills component of what they're trying to achieve. So that can cover a pretty broad range of things, everything from developing confidence to regulating our nervous system, managing fear, learning how to focus better under pressure. And I get to have these conversations and do this work with a pretty broad range of athletes in different sports and also outside of sport a little bit as well.
Hmm.
And I suppose the other thing would be just that I kind of came to this from my own background as an athlete. And so I know firsthand, I suppose, how useful these tools are in the sport context. And since then, I've also learned personally how useful they are, just like in a life in general context.
You have, I was kind of thinking about this the other day prior to us coming on this conversation, and I'm sure anyone who knows you personally will agree with me on this. You have an extremely calming energy, and you are around people, and just yeah, it's just like I think the best way to explain it is just a general sense of calmness, controlled. Do you have to work on that, or is that something that came or comes naturally to you? Is that the chicken or the egg scenario?
An interesting question. I don't know if I've ever thought specifically about that before, about whether that's, I mean, I suppose it's your, as an individual, it's always interesting to think about how you perceive yourself versus how other people perceive you. And
Or
so, first question that came to my mind was like, do I see myself as a calm, in control individual? And I suppose I see that I have those aspects of that in myself. Um, However, it's not, I suppose it's not something that maybe I'm as aware of as perhaps you as being an outside person perceiving me. So that's all very interesting. Does it come naturally? I suppose to an extent, yes. You know, if I think of my parents, they're both very calm individuals with a lot of kind of, yeah, like that calm presence and that sense of knowing themselves and having a bit of confidence there. So I've no doubt maybe part of that just comes through genes and also environment. But I would say that also that the work that I do has helped me to cultivate that. It's helped me to be more confident in myself and my ability to communicate with other people and to communicate clearly. And I'm sure that those skills contribute to that energy that you referenced there.
yeah, what do people not understand about? Is there much of a difference between sports psychology and general psychology? Like, what is the clear? What's the line there that needs to be crossed?
So when you say general psychology, I kind of comes to what comes to mind for me is like counseling and therapy. Is
Yeah,
that what
yeah,
you were? Okay,
yeah.
perfect. Yeah, so counseling and therapy is there is a little bit of a line between that and sports psychology coaching. And the line is usually drawn around the main point of focus in the work that you do together. So in therapy, there's a real focus on healing. Um, and usually that involves going into the person's past to try to understand very deeply their previous experiences. Sometimes those experiences were very challenging experiences. And the work involves going into the past, looking at that more closely, seeking to understand, process, and maybe integrate so that there can be healing and resolution that comes from that, and which then allows the person to move forward. Now, in sports psychology coaching, our focus is usually less on that deeper level of healing and more on fine tuning or optimizing that person's ability to manage the pressure or the challenge that they're facing.
Mhm.
Sometimes that involves looking a little bit at aspects from the person's past and maybe supporting them to do a little bit of that processing and integrating. But for the most part, we stay a little bit more in the present or even looking towards the future to really equip them or empower them with like the knowledge and the tools that they need to move forward and meet whatever challenge it is that they've chosen to undertake.
Yeah, get it. Where does injury come into play there? So I'm assuming that it's not just performance based, it's also injury based, and
Mm.
again, assuming that one of the challenges that you and by the way, you know, for the listeners, you work with athletes like right across the board, from equestrian athletes, lacrosse, GAA players, like everything right across the board. So assuming that,
Yeah.
I think I heard you say before, some of the more extreme cases you had dealt with was like, you know, obviously people coming off a horse,
Mhm.
hurting something, and then having to get back on the horse to, you know, rehabilitate in a sense. Like, what is the process there? Do you still dig into the past, or is it still future focused? Or sorry, flip that.
Yeah, yeah. It depends a little bit on the person and the context. So when you think about injury in sport, that's always a challenge. And then there's sort of various levels of trauma, I suppose, attached to that injury, depending on how violently it occurred. So if you think about an athlete, like a GA athlete, right, who would face injuries all the time, they're the emotions around those injuries are usually primarily just frustration, like frustration about being halted in their training, about not being able to do what they want to do, maybe some fear of that injury impacting their future ability in the sport, right? Or taking them out of the running. And so there is some fear involved there. Sports like equestrian sport, it's a little different because usually the injury occurs in a much more violent way where the person is like thrown through the air, or like there's a loss of control where maybe the horse has bolted or run away before that person has fallen off. So there's usually a lot more just natural fear like infused into the experience and the memory. And so in those cases, even if sometimes the injury itself is relatively minor, and maybe that the rider in this case only has to take a week or so off of riding, sometimes the fear is the bigger issue. And that we have to help that person really like process the fears and give them tools to essentially override it. So that can come down to understanding how what we're thinking about either fuels or deactivates our fear. It also helps to understand and practice focusing skills, because what we're focusing our attention on can help us either feel in danger or feel safe. And so in the moment, how we're using these tools can really impact our experience and help us feel like, essentially help us to either override the fear or succumb to the fear. And the tools, the mental tools are often the main differentiator between whether we're able to actually overcome it. And then once we overcome it and start to build new experiences again, that really fuels our confidence and enables us usually to leave that scary experience mostly in the past.
What are some of the more extreme cases that you have dealt with in the past?
Yeah, all the extreme injuries that I've dealt with come from equestrian sport. It's
Right.
it, it's a dangerous sport. It's something a lot of people don't realize. When you get hurt, the chances of it being a bad injury are quite high. So I've had people who've, I mean, I don't know, we don't get too grisly, but who have like have been stepped on by horses, had their heads stepped on by horses, have broken bones, have had horses fall on them. So, and those are all experiences that can, in the moment, essentially, when we're experiencing those really scary things, um, if we have the thought like I might die here or this might seriously harm me, that's will turn it into a bit of a traumatic experience. Like that's sort of the trigger often for that experience becoming laced with some trauma moving forward. is if we genuinely feel like maybe we could be very seriously injured or we might even die.
Is there, when it comes to, obviously I have a keen interest in combat sports.
Mhm.
Is there, do you see a difference when it comes to sports psychology with combat sport athletes, and what are the key sort of details that you would be dealing with when it comes to those guys? Because again, I can only, I obviously I can place myself in their shoes, and again, my assumption is anxiousness. Whereas equestrian, there's no real opportunity to be anxious about getting hurt. It's like it happens in a split second. Whereas combat sport, there's the waiting and anticipation of conflict. What is the what are some of the more detailed aspects of that when it comes to sports psychology?
Yeah, in combat sport, it's not if you're going to get hurt, it's just
Man.
and how often and how badly. Yeah. And it creates a very interesting dynamic psychologically. So you have that, yeah, like guaranteed pain, let's call it, right? And hardship ahead of you. Then you have also the fact that you're very literally about to fight someone, right? And so that is that's the exact, criteria that's going to kick off our nervous system, right? And our nervous system is going to be interpreting that as a fight for our life, even though we know, of course, it isn't. That the context of that is going to really raise the stakes for our nervous system. So that means that, yeah, heightened anxiety, all of those fight or flight responses are going to kick in, which is not helpful from a staying calm and fighting strategically perspective. So from what I see, the biggest challenge with combat sports is not just going into full on fight or flight mode in the fight. In another case where you're just going totally on instinct, you're not thinking at all. There's no sense of calm or composure about what you're doing because you're just in full on like fight for your life kind of mode.
Mm.
And I think what happens is that early on, that can sort of work okay to just go into that place. But as you move up the levels and it becomes more technical and you start fighting other people who actually have figured out how to stay calm and composed while doing it, that's not going to work anymore, right? And so to get to the higher levels, that from my perspective, in the mental side of things, that's a really key component that we have to figure out um, how to fight and bring that intensity that's so required in that sport, but bring it from a place of like laser sharp focus and like in like ironclad calm composure, as opposed to bringing the intensity from panic, essentially, that sort of naturally sets in.
What are some of the best practices for doing that? I
Mm.
again for I've personal experience, I kind of struggle to not obviously, there are aspects, I was amateur boxer and jujitsu and everything else.
Mhm.
Sometimes from my own personal experience, I'm either all or nothing. I'm either like
Mhm.
default aggressive or sometimes just too calm and composed. It's almost like trying to fit both the default aggressive mode, but also calm and composed into the one bowl and mix it up at times. What are some of the
Yeah.
best practices that you've seen for being able to do that?
Learning to control your breath is huge, 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 because it is often it's a very simple tool. We're breathing anyway, so we might as well do it in an intentional way. And but regulating your breath does is that it often moves the dial just enough. So I often think about the relationship between performance and how activated your nervous system is, because informs us in this exact conversation, right? So if we are really understimulated, so our nervous system is really low, has like a really low level of activation, we tend to not perform very well. That's because we're just like, we don't care enough. It doesn't feel important enough to pay attention, to put in our full effort. However, we can go all the way over to the other end of the spectrum where if our nervous system is extremely stimulated and really overactivated, then we're also not going to perform well. Um, Now, there's a sweet spot in the middle. And so the mistake that we often make is that we often think that the more stressed I am, the worse I'm going to perform. So we think that it's like a really linear relationship. Like if I'm really, really calm, then I'll perform really well. And if I'm really, really stressed, then I won't. And it just moves, you know, in a natural progression across that spectrum. But it's not, it's like a semicircle where our performance will improve as our stress increases, but only to a point. There's kind of a sweet spot, and then as our stress continues to increase, the performance starts to drop off. So that's really relevant for fighters because yeah, it's not about being so calm that you now drop into this like understimulated place. And so learning to regulate your breathing can be a tool that helps you to just come back from that too stimulated place just enough to find that nice mid ground. There's also breathing techniques that help us to intensify like how activated we are. So if we find that we're continuously understimulated, we can actually breathe in such a way that like increases our focus and hypes us up a little bit.
Okay.
So there's a
How would,
lot of
how would
tools.
that
Yeah.
go? Yeah, how would that go? I wouldn't like I'm aware of what we call it kind of crocodile breathing in the fitness industry, you know, just like deep
Yeah.
breaths and diaphragmatic breathing in
Yeah.
order to stimulate more. Is it the opposite? Is it like faster, more rapid breaths?
Essentially, yeah. So the easiest way to remember this is that when we do a deep breath with a long exhale, so we're lengthening out the breathing and we're engaging our diaphragm, then that's going to have usually a calming effect. So when the exhale is longer than the inhale, that's going to have a calming effect. When the inhale is longer than the exhale, that's going to have a little bit of an activating effect.
Okay.
So if you were to do, it would be right or would be the activating.
Okay. So one's basically bringing you to sympathetic, one's going to bring you to parasympathetic.
Exactly, yeah. And that should be used, the activating one should be used with some caution. Again, we don't want to overhype ourselves into too like getting too activated. And so what I usually teach that only to people who are like really stuck in that calm place. Typically, all that we need to move from understimulated to that like nice little mid zone is just to have a little conversation with ourselves about how much this matters to us and why we're here and all the hard work we've put in and like why we've chosen to do this. And usually that's enough to dial things up or ramp things up enough to get us into that midpoint.
Wow. Can someone, so I always used to say, you can't think your way to a new way of acting. You have to act your way to a new way of acting.
Mm,
Sorry, let me rephrase this. You can't think your way to a new way of acting. You need to act your way to a new way of thinking.
yes. And that's Joe Dispenza's whole perspective, isn't it? Like he talks a lot about that. That yeah, that you have to be someone different in order to think differently. And so the change starts with the being or with the actions, which
Mhm.
is really interesting, right? And that's a very different perspective than the one that say comes from like cognitive behavioral coaching or cognitive behavioral therapy, where
Yeah,
actually the emphasis is put on the thought that
yeah.
would say that the thought drives the feeling, which drives the action. So therefore, if we can change our thoughts, that'll help us feel different and it will help produce different behavior.
Is that just
Uh,
person dependent?
sorry?
Is that just person dependent?
To an extent, I think so. What I've noticed is that some people are very in their thinking in their experience, and other people are more in a felt sense or a feeling awareness in the way that they experience uh, what were you thinking in that moment? And some people will be like, oh, I was thinking this. They'll know exactly what they were thinking. And other people will be like, I don't know, I just felt really stressed.
Hmm.
So they don't know what the thought was, but they could clearly remember the feeling. So there is definitely some variation there. And people who are more naturally in their thinking mind, I think it works quite well to get in there and bring their awareness to what's a helpful thought, what's not a helpful thought, and how do we create better thinking. So better thinking, in the way that I explain it, has three components. It's positive, but not positive like, oh, everything's great and we're cheerful all the time. Positive in that we're focusing on what we want to have happen. It's empowering. It's reminding us of our strengths and why we can do it and how we can do it, and our ability. And then three, it's true. So a lot of unhelpful thinking is fundamentally false. Our brain is really, really good at essentially inventing stories, right, that aren't actually true and are usually very critical or self-depreciating. And so by sort of fact checking and checking in with our thinking and tuning in towards trying to create thinking that is positive, empowering, and true, I have seen that that does change how people feel about a situation, which then enables them to act differently or change the way that they're behaving. However, I do think that for a lot of people and in many different cases, it can also work to really focus in on the action. What am I doing differently? And that when we start to do things differently, it does also help us to produce new thinking about it because it changes our experience. So it's a real chicken and egg thing. It's a tough one to, like, I don't know if anyone knows for sure exactly how that process works. I think it's extremely interrelated. And
Yeah.
yeah, maybe it's about the individual in terms of like what way of going about that is going to be the most impactful.
Yeah. Best just to use the best tool available to you as and when you need it, I suppose.
Yeah. I would say use tools from both lines of thought, right? I think that's really useful. So definitely become more aware of your thinking and work on improving your thinking, because in my experience, that always helps. But don't get just caught in just the thought, right? Like also consider the action. And I think if you can actually kind of come at it from both angles nearly simultaneously, then that's a pretty powerful formula for change.
How, what are your thoughts on like affirmations? Because I know that kind of this type of thing sort of gets a bad rep these days,
Mhm.
with like a lot of people kind of shooting it down. And I think, based on at least my understanding of it, in the past, people were telling themselves that they're the happiest person in the world in the mirror. It was the whole positivity um, sort of era. And then it almost became debunked in a sense that there was a lot of authors and stuff coming out and writing about it and saying, look, it doesn't matter how often you tell yourself you're happy in the mirror. If your behaviors aren't matching what you're telling yourself, you're never going to believe it. It's like, uh, believe that this is I'm holding a pencil, but try to believe that this is a pen. No matter what, it's always going to be a pencil. And so,
Yeah.
like the human, it feels kind of silly in a sense, but is
Yeah.
there merit to the practice in any way that you see?
I think it comes back to what we're choosing to repeat to ourselves. And absolutely, our brain can kind of knows when we're lying to ourselves or trying to convince ourselves of something that isn't true. And so that's another reason why I have this aspect of truth in this concept of better thinking, because it's really important that we don't try to fool ourselves, because it just doesn't really work. As you said, like it's not a pen, it's a pencil. And our sense of reality and objectivity is always going to kind of pull us back to that. So if we think about it, what we really want is we want to change up really unhelpful, really negative ways of thinking about ourselves with things that are more helpful. And it's definitely too far a stretch. If you're really unhappy every day, it's too far of a stretch. It's too far from your actual reality to say, I'm happy. It's just a falsehood at that point. However, if you were to structure that affirmation differently and say something like, I'm going to try to help myself be happier today, or I want to be happier, and I'm going to stay open to how I might be able to make that happen for myself.
Mm,
Now that's a true statement. And I would argue it's still a helpful statement because it's focusing that individual on action and on their desire to change and feel differently, which is probably going to be the first step in the long process that hopefully will lead them to actually being happier and understanding the source of their unhappiness.
Yeah, I heard T Harv Eker, wrote Secrets of a Millionaire Mind.
Mm-hmm.
I once heard him say, and I really love this. He said, stop making affirmations and start making declarations.
Yes,
So
lovely
rather,
way of putting it.
yeah, so rather than, and that's exactly what I'm hearing you say there. It's like rather than trying to lie to yourself, which is never going to work, at least declare something and stick to it. Like do what you said you would do, whatever that thing is. I'm going to try to be happier today, and I'm going to stay open to the possibility, or whatever things come my way. I'm going to stay
Mhm.
open to them, and if it works, nice. If not, back to the drawing board.
Yeah. It's a much healthier way to set the expectation for yourself as well, right? Because saying I am happy also creates this weird sense of pressure now that you have to somehow just be happy, which it won't help. It won't help the ultimate goal. So it's about so again, if you I do find this framework very helpful, right? So positive, empowering, true. So positive in this case would be I want to feel happier. That's the positive thinking. That's tuning into what do I actually want in this situation. Empowering is reminding yourself that that's possible. Even if I don't know how it's possible yet, I'm going to choose to believe I have the ability to learn or figure out what I need to figure out in order to improve my life and feel happier. And truth is that, okay, I actually don't feel happy right now, but I'm going to choose to focus on the potential to be happier and my desire and therefore my decision or my declaration of intent to pursue that and stay open to it.
Mm,
And I do find that that's really helpful, and you can apply it to, I haven't found a situation yet where that sort of three-part framework doesn't create a much more helpful focus. And then part of the thing around affirmations is just the idea of repeating something to yourself over and over again as a way of kind of like impacting your subconscious.
yeah.
And there is research that supports that when we come back to an idea over and over again, right, that it does actually start to feel more true over time. And so there is value, I think, in like really anchoring yourself to a declaration or concept and coming back to it again and again. It'll help to continue to produce new thinking. It'll help you over time. It'll start to feel more possible. Perfect example was for me when I first started out after my master's. I had a lot of fear around starting a business. I felt very prepared to do the psychology side of things, but no one had told me anything about starting a business, and I was quite overwhelmed by that. And I felt deep down that I wasn't an entrepreneur or a business owner. I'd never thought of myself that way. But I also knew that that was very unhelpful and counterproductive to what I was about to go and try and do. And so I did over a period of time practice saying to myself, like, I am a business owner. I am an entrepreneur. Like, I can do this. Now, that was true. So that helped because I was actively starting a business, right? So I wasn't lying to myself, but I had to repeat that concept to myself and almost like familiarize myself with it over a period of several months before it started to feel true. And that was also helped by the actions I was taking in that area as well. Um, yeah, so there is a value to that sort of sitting with a concept and coming back to it and building your sense of reality or truth around it.
Are you familiar with hypnosis?
Not with any real layer of like knowledge. It's not something I practice. It's not something that I've tried personally, although I am very interested in it. It comes up a lot in the reading that I do. It is a popular technique in a lot of different areas, certainly.
Yeah, because randomly I was chatting to a lady on the street one time, and I asked her what she done, and she says she worked in hypnosis. And I'd remembered because one of the I remember it was actually Russell Brunson talking about like some of the ways to really embed learning is to teach it to someone else, like immerse yourself in the topic, but also hypnosis. And then I
Hmm.
was curious as to, I was like, oh, okay. Then when this lady said, oh, I work in hypnosis. And what was funny about it was we were just doing like we were stopping people randomly on the street and asking them why do they go to the gym? Do they focus on nutrition
Hmm.
and so on and so forth? And when I said to her, would you like to go to the gym more? She said, yes, I would love to. I just don't really, I can't dedicate the time. And she came up with a few excuses. And then when she said, I said to her, what do you do for a living? She says, I hypnotize people. And I said, well, maybe you should hypnotize yourself and that may force you to go to the gym. And it was all, it was in good spirit, but I was just
Yeah,
wondering,
yeah.
um, from a sports psychology standpoint, I actually remember years ago, Steve Collins, you won't be familiar with this, I don't think anyway, but he beat Chris Eubank for the world
Hmm.
title. He's one of the most famous Irish boxers, and he was practicing hypnosis right up until the bell rang. So
Hmm.
see,
Interesting.
yeah, he had on like headphones because Chris Eubank, he was very distracting. You know, he would try to almost like peacock his way into the gym and he would take, or sorry, into the ring, and he would take more time going in there and he would have this really extravagant entrance to the ring. But Steve
Right.
Collins, he had like, you know, the headphones on. This was in like the early 90s and there was some sort of hypnosis playing in the background. And I was always curious, like it wasn't something that I would ever looked deeply into, but I was wondering in your line of work, have you ever come across that?
Um, have I ever worked with someone who's also doing hypnosis? I don't think so. I've certainly heard it talked about a lot. I know I've had clients who have tried hypnosis at different times in the past. I don't think I've ever worked with someone who's doing it concurrently to our work together. Um, it's interesting though, because like what comes to mind when you describe that exact scenario with the boxer with the earphones in, that's a great example of just like a focusing strategy. And there's so many different ways that you can do that, but it's giving your mind something very specific and very helpful to focus on. Um, I think in a way, meditation has become like the new thing, whereas maybe hypnosis was more popular. I could be wrong on that, but that is my general feeling that meditation is more talked about and more kind of discussed as a technique these days over hypnosis. And I think I would argue that there's some commonalities between the two techniques, and that it's kind of like a deep focusing tool.
Mm.
Um, and so I think there's certainly value to take from that example for anyone listening, right? That yeah, distraction and what you're focusing on is a huge part of your mental preparation. And so anytime that you can like harness and capture your focus and be able to like really direct it to something that's helpful, that's usually going to be very useful. But no, I don't have a ton of firsthand experience with hypnosis. Always been interested by it. And I think that there's certainly merit to it for some people. Some people speak about it being something that really helps them to unlock or change a very deep pattern of thought or behavior, which I think can be incredibly useful. It may be also another factor there, maybe about like, again, the repetition, hearing something multiple times when you're in a really deep, focused, ultra relaxed state. Perhaps there's some argument there that helps that thinking integrate more into your subconscious and can again kind of accelerate change. But I don't know where the research stands on it at this point in time. Actually, it's not something that I've dug into with any great depth.
What are some of the other practices that you had mentioned to dial in focus? I know you said breathing. Is there anything else?
Yeah, it's around learning to direct your attention and understanding sort of different focus styles is very useful. So you can have an internal or an external focus. Internal is sort of something that's going on within you, external is outside of you. And then you can also have a broad or a narrow focus. So narrow being you're just sort of focusing on one aspect of the self or one thing outside of you, broad being that you're integrating lots of information. So for athletes, it can be really useful to think about what focus style do I need given the sport that I'm in or the challenge that I'm facing. So like a rugby player who is on defense is going to really benefit from a broad external focus style. because they need to be like reading the play, reading the field, seeing the movement, understanding the movement, and processing the movement of many different people. Whereas a fighter or an equestrian is actually going to be benefit from a more narrow focus. So for a fighter, we don't want that fighter picking up and thinking about what all the people in the crowd are doing. We want them focusing in on just like, what is my opponent doing, and maybe what am I doing, or how am I feeling in this moment, or what's my decision. Same thing for an equestrian. We don't want them scanning the crowd, thinking about all these different things. We just want them very present in the moment with their horse, jumping the jump in front of them or performing the movement they need to perform. So it's very sport specific, but understanding that can be very useful, because very often we get pulled into a focus style that's not helpful to us. We may become too internally focused when actually we need the external focus, or vice versa. So there's some really good learning around that, and that just builds awareness of like, what am I focusing on at any given moment, and how is that impacting my performance? And through that awareness, some very useful change and skill building can happen. And then just building the understanding that we can always direct our focus, but that's a little bit of like a muscle that we often need to strengthen. So we can always choose what we're focusing on, and left unattended, our brain often directs our focus to things that are not relevant or not helpful to what we're trying to do. But with practice, we can get very good at recognizing when our focus has been stolen away by something, and bringing it back to the task at hand, or the focus style that we need in the moment. And that's actually something that's really interesting and really clear in the research, is that really high level athletes usually have that in common. They have a very high level of skill over directing and managing and staying in control of their focus while they're performing.
Have you ever looked at the impact of music when it comes to focus?
Yeah, for some people, that's an incredible focus tool. It's not for everyone, but for some people, it can help them focus. It can also help them regulate, in that depending on the type of music they're listening to, it can have a real impact over their emotional state or their nervous system.
Mm.
So for people who maybe struggle with being in the really high end of activation, where that negatively impacts performance, listening to like calming, focusing music can really help them dial back. For people who tend to be in the understimulated, almost too calm range, listening to active, invigorating, like upbeat music can really help. And for anyone, what they find is that listening to music that you enjoy always has like a positive impact on your nervous system. So there's definitely usefulness there. It for the people who love that tool, I find like love it and use it a lot. And then there's other people who are just like, no, I don't want to be listening to music. They almost find it to be too distracting. Those people find that they need to have some kind of mental engagement with what they're doing. And so then we just have to fine tune that so that they're managing that in a helpful way.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
I used to listen to by the way, little side note, I'm not condoning R. Kelly in any way, shape, or form. But I used to listen to, and I'm not suggesting you go out and buy his music or anything like that, but his song "The World's Greatest,"
Mm,
like any
yeah,
time, maybe, I would have had something big going on. I used to
yeah.
pop it on, and I actually used to get my kids to listen to it all the time on the way to school,
Right.
because I would have
Oh, cool.
said, boys, you're going to have the greatest day. This is going to be your song. And I would have played it. And
Yeah.
there's definitely, again, I don't like the man, but his music, or at least that song, there's definitely something that changes in you. There's definitely something that changes in your energy when you listen to it. And
Um,
yeah, I was just curious as to how that plays out right across the board. How much of what people consume impacts their psychology? Because there is a big thing around this today, as in like there's unlimited information. Like you just open up your phone and it's right there at your fingertips. Like how much truly does it impact your psychology of what people consume on a day-to-day basis?
I think it does have a really big impact. We are always influenced by our environment, and what we're consuming makes up a big portion of that environment. What we're exposed to. it influences our thinking and also our emotional state. And that can have interesting impacts. So one thing that I've noticed a lot of, right, is that there's sort of a movement of people disengaging from the news these days, right? And they often speak about that because as a form of sort of self-protection, because of the really powerful negative emotions that are evoked when we're watching these really difficult things play out, right, that we don't have much control over. Or the fear that that evokes of the potential impacts for us in the world and what's going to happen. And so yeah, I think it's very important to remember that what we consume absolutely impacts our thinking and also has a huge impact over our emotional state. And it can make it very hard to self-regulate if we are constantly being exposed to really scary or really difficult ideas or imagery. And there's a lot of different, perspectives on whether we, how much of that we should be paying attention to or processing. If I'm working with someone who's sort of struggling with that, I always, get them to think about, okay, well, there's different ways to get information. So it's going to be a lot less emotionally difficult to read about something than it is going to be to watch it. So if you have a desire to be staying informed with what's happening, but you're really struggling with like the big emotional impact of like seeing it play out in front of you on videos, then I would say maybe like tune out from the video content and maybe just check in with written content in order to stay more up to date with things. So it's again, you can kind of, if you're aware of the fact that what you're digesting, what you're consuming is impacting you, then I think you can make some smart decisions for yourself about how to do that or how much to consume. And I think it is important for us to help ourselves regulate our nervous systems. We have a lot of stress in our day-to-day world. So our nervous systems are most of us already have nervous systems that are struggling to regulate. And so when you add in that really difficult content or that really difficult focus, that can really throw us off and it can make it very hard so when I say regulate, I mean kind of like keep ourselves in like a healthy, balanced place emotionally, where we're not tipping towards extreme anxiety or high levels of depression symptoms or even just feeling like really out of control and really not okay. So I suppose I'm trying to think of how do I summarize what I'm trying to say here is that, yeah, I think be aware that what we consume definitely influences us. And I think if we can be a little bit more intentional about what and how we consume instead of just letting it all in all the time, that can help us. And so for different people, there would be different choices there to be made based on whether or not what I suppose what their goals are, like how do they want to feel and what do they want to know?
Nice. What is ahead in the coming months for Annika McGivern?
Summer is show season for the equestrian community, so there's going to be a lot of on the ground at the big shows with that crowd, which I'm looking forward to. Some other sports like swimming and lacrosse and rugby will quiet off a little bit as the kids go on their summer holidays. Um, a big one personally for me is just enjoying summer in Canada, which will probably have quite a bit more sunshine than my last few summers, hopefully, fingers crossed. And lots of lovely experiences like swimming in lakes and going camping and catching up with some old friends and also celebrating my dad's wedding, which is going to be really nice.
Oh,
He's
incredible. Incredible.
married. So lots of nice experiences for sure, personally. And then, yeah, from a professional perspective, it's going to be a lot of helping the people who've been like building their skills now in preparation for this year's competition season, like really supporting them to put that into action and move their way through the competition season, which is going to be a lot of fun.
Do you obviously the athletes are there. I never imagined that there would be like a bit of a chaotic crowd at an equestrian event, but is that the case?
No, I mean, it's chaotic in that there's like a lot's happening and there's
Yeah.
usually, like thousands of people and horses there and there's multiple rings and all that sort of thing. But But in terms of chaotic crowds, not really. People are very as respectful,
Yeah.
aware that horses are, flight animals, prey animals, and are easily startled. And so
Mm.
people, they move slowly, they try not to run. Dogs are on a leash for the
Yeah.
most part. There's a certain kind of there's a certain order to it all in order to support the horses to be okay and perform.
Yeah. And are you there for the athletes beforehand? Like, what does the preparation look like there? What's your part to play before they uh get onto the track? Is it a track? It's not a track, is it?
So it's usually an arena. So
Yeah.
a lot of the sports I work with are arena based. So there might be a course set up of jumps in an arena,
Right.
or they might have to ride a pattern or something like that.
Yeah.
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 Um,
What is your part?
yeah, so it's largely in the preparation and then also in the processing after. So it's in helping making sure that they're dialed in to the right focus, the right mindset, that they've got their routine down. And I mean, this is true for any sport, when we're talking about preparing for a performance moment. You're dialing into the tools that ideally you've been practicing for a while up until that point, and you're getting yourself into this sort of optimal mind state where you're present, you're open, you're not putting too much pressure on yourself, you're thinking about what you've got to do, you're hopefully tapping into a little bit of excitement and enjoyment, and maybe even gratitude for where you are and what you're about to do. You're trusting yourself, you're not overthinking it, you're kind of basically reminding yourself that I've got this, I don't have to overthink it because I know it. My subconscious knows it at this point. I've learned this. And then you're just kind of going out and doing it. So I'm supporting them with that process, and then helping them with the kind of integrating and analysis, I suppose, of what happened. So
Yeah.
it's very natural for athletes if they come out of the ring or out of off the field and they feel it hasn't been good for whatever reason, maybe a mistake was made or the result wasn't achieved. They can go into, or everyone can go into a very critical, very kind of negative place quite easily.
Yes.
And about helping them to stay in that learning mindset, to integrate their learning, right, from what happened, to practice that growth mindset, in action, right? So seeing the mistake as a learning opportunity, finding the lesson in that, not being hard on themselves, and then taking all that learning and kind of like throwing it forward into their next actions.
Hmm.
So
Is there any benefits to being to falling towards the more critical side of your performance?
So interestingly, a lot of athletes are very high on what we would call like the perfectionism scale, if you will. Like the
Yeah.
people are tend to be perfectionists. Now, perfectionism is undoubtedly a strength in many ways, but like anything, it can also be a weakness. So the strength in perfectionism comes from it makes us quite detail orientated. It usually makes us quite goal driven. It usually encourages people to work very hard. So those are all great things that are going to help us be successful. Where it tips into a weakness is where it influences us to feel like nothing but perfect is good enough. Any mistake is a major failure or an indication that we're not good enough or we can't do it. And it can also influence us to be hyper self-critical of everything that we do, and almost like unable to see the good and the growth in what we're doing because we become so hyper focused on what didn't work or what wasn't successful in that match or that course. And that really impedes our ability to learn and move forward. So there is value in being able to take a really good, realistic look at what happened and not hide from the problems. So not hide from the fact that like, wow, that really didn't work, or like, okay, that was a mistake. That isn't how I want to ultimately perform in that moment. But there's no value in being mean to ourselves about that. So the critical part, if we're saying critical and like critically thinking about it, where we're really trying to, understand exactly what happened and use that information to our advantage, that's useful. But critical in terms of being really cruel to yourself
Yeah.
is never helpful. Um, Perfectionists think often that they have to be mean to themselves in order to drive themselves to be better. And the research is so clear on this that it just doesn't work in the long term. It can sort of sometimes work in the short term, but that almost always leads to burnout and sort of disillusionment with the sport and what you're doing, which will usually cause you to back off or give up. And so it's really important that we recognize that it's actually much more powerful to drive ourselves positively, which is where we connect to, like, why does this matter to me? Why do I want to do it? The reasons you have for wanting to be excellent at this thing, and allow yourself to be pulled forward instead of like pushing yourself forward with constant with constant criticism and like a fear of failure.
Instead of being your own biggest critic, try being your own biggest coach.
Exactly. It works so much better.
Amazing. Annika, if there was something that I should have asked you in this conversation but didn't, what would it be?
I suppose we've talked a lot about sport, haven't we? And a lot about athletes. And so there may be people listening who are thinking, well, I'm not specifically an athlete, or I'm not doing a sport, but I have other challenges. And so maybe it would have been a question about, like, how does this apply outside of sport, or does it apply outside of sport? And the answer is absolutely. I think that the more I do this work, the more I see these skills as actually just like skills that help us be successful in life, regardless of the challenges that we have individually. So for an athlete, a lot of their challenges will be sport related. But these are skills that actually help us across all types of challenges. So they help us be stronger in relationships. They help us be more confident and sure of ourselves. They help us professionally. They help us do things like that, push ourselves outside of our comfort zone, that helps us feel like we're living more in alignment with the life that we want or with our values. So if you are not an athlete, don't take that as information. Don't take this as information that isn't for you. It's really for everyone. And these are skills that, regardless of who you are and what you want to do, they will help you be more successful, whatever your goals are.
Incredible, Annika. Where can my listeners connect with you?
So you can find my website. It's just my name, so it's easy, AnnikaMcGivern.com. You can contact me through the website. You can also find me on Instagram. It's AnnikaMcGivern.performance. On LinkedIn, if you're on LinkedIn, I'm also there. It's just my name, Annika McGivern. I also have a podcast it's very specifically for equestrians, the one that I just created. But if there are any equestrians listening, it's called the Ready to Ride podcast, and it has a bit of a unique angle where it's tracks that you can listen to as you're preparing for your ride to kind of get your mind tuned in. I've actually had a few other athletes listen to it and say that they found it quite helpful, regardless, because of course the skills are all the same. It's just that there's some context there talking about the horse and whatnot. So if you leave that out, it may still be useful for you. So feel free to check that out. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, or they just are curious about this, they want to talk more, I'm always delighted to talk to people and just chat more about it and answer any questions. So reach out anytime.
Yeah, Annika, just to reiterate earlier, anytime I'm in your company, I always leave it feeling more calmed, just purely being in your presence. You definitely have that impact on people, and it's definitely infectious. So thank you so much, and appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's a really lovely thing to hear. So very kind of you to say, and it's always a pleasure. I love the conversations we have. You ask great questions, and it's a delight to talk with someone who is such a great thinker and is so interested in all the different aspects of performance and life.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Annika.
You bet. My pleasure.